Okay, friends. Um, we are in this Sandel text. We started this last week. Okay, I don't see many of them here. Have we been able to do any of the reading in the Sandel text? Some of it? It's a quick read, folks. It goes quickly. It's full of examples to illustrate what he has to say, so it makes it an easy text to get through. And in the first chapter, we talked about, last week, we talked about the moral strengths and weaknesses in markets as illustrated by the application of market-based solutions to social coordination problems. One example of a social coordination problem that Sandel goes through in the first chapter is line standing. Okay, and wherever you see a line, that's an indication that demand is greater than supply. And that's a social coordination breakdown because it's worth almost no one's time to stand in line for, as such. Okay, and so market-based solutions have been used to try to make those kinds of problems go away with mixed success. And we used that illustration of a market-based solution to social coordination problems to look at two strengths and one weakness, and we're going to start in with another weakness today. The two strengths, without a doubt, are that markets maximize liberty. Markets maximize the freedom of choice of those who are willing and able to pay. So if it's an airport security line social coordination problem, and all the ordinary people are standing in the long line, and those people who pay for a quick pass to get through the line get to go through in a very short amount of time, this is a market-based solution. Those who are willing and able to pay are able to receive the good in question, namely passage through the airport security line much more quickly. And that maximizes the freedom of those who are willing to pay. Okay, we also looked at how markets maximize efficiency. That's the second moral strength of markets. They maximize efficiency for the society as a whole. We've come up with almost no other distribution system that is better than capitalist markets at maximizing social efficiency. And the reason why is because no one knows better than you do what your true interests and desires are. You know better than everybody else what you're willing to spend money on and what you're not willing to spend money on. And as such, a market-based solution puts it in your hands, in my hands, in each one of our hands, to choose whether or not to pay the money to get the good in question, like the faster passage through the airport security line. You and I are experts in our own affairs, and so we make our own lives more efficient by being given market-based solutions and participating in those market-based solutions because we express more efficiently than anybody else can do on our own behalf what our values are and what we are willing to spend money on. And if it is worth it to you to pay money so as not to stand in a line, then that's good, because it's good for society to know that, and it's good for you to express it, because that maximizes society's efficiency. We looked at one weakness, though, of markets, and that is that markets discriminate against those who do not have means. So you may have a strong desire to obtain the good in question. You may really, really, really want to get through the line quickly to ride the roller coaster at the theme park, but if you haven't bought the pass, if you don't have the means to buy the pass to get you through the fast line, then that strong desire is not something you're going to be able to realize. So markets then discriminate against those who do not have means. There are two groups of people here. One is those who are impoverished as such, and the other is those who have some means but are not willing to pay because the means that they have are not so great that they're able to express their desires easily in terms of purchasing the good in question. I want to look, though, at a second moral weakness of markets to get our class started today. And I'm going to do so in the context of a discussion of chapter 2 of Sandel's text. Okay, so this is the incentives chapter. If you've got your book with you, please open that up. If I told you that you could get $3,000 for every A you receive this semester, would you be more highly motivated to do well in your classes than you currently are? Let's be honest. Yes? Yes? Okay. Did you know that you actually are already being paid for doing well in your classes? You're being paid in the form of a future compensation in your career trajectory, in your first job and subsequent jobs that look at your college GPA. It's just not a tangible, immediate goal. The idea of a $3,000 tangible, immediate goal would be very motivating for me as well. But the idea of a nebulous, higher salary several years from now is much less motivating. It's uncertain. There's no hard number. It's far off in the future. So it's much less motivating. Well, actually, economists have tried to test the capacity of markets to motivate people and solve certain non-market problems like motivating people to get good grades in several different contexts. Let me read on pages 52 and 53. Follow along in your text, please. Okay, so in New York City, participating schools paid fourth graders $25 to score well on standardized tests. Seventh graders could earn $50 per test. In Washington, D.C., schools paid middle school students cash rewards for attendance, good behavior, and turning in their homework. Conscientious kids could make up to $100 every 2 weeks. In Chicago, they offered ninth graders cash for getting good grades in their courses, $50 for an A, $35 for a B, and $20 for a C. In Dallas, they paid second graders $2 for each book they read. To collect the cash, students have to take a computerized quiz to prove they've read the book. How did all this turn out? Well, the cash payments, according to Sandel, yielded mixed results. In New York City, paying kids for good test scores did nothing to improve their academic performance. The cash for good grades in Chicago led to better attendance, but no improvement on standardized tests. In Washington, the payments helped some students achieve higher reading scores. The cash worked best with the Dallas second graders, those capitalist Texans. The kids who got paid $2 per book wound up with higher reading comprehension scores at the end of the year. Was anybody paid in high school for your grades? Did your parents pay you? One time? Did it work? It did. That's cool. That's cool. Here's the concern that a lot of business ethicists express about using market-based solutions to deal with these kinds of problems. The concern is that it corrupts the good that it touches. There's nothing that better expresses naked self-interest than monetary payment. Okay, if you're getting paid for something, that reduces whatever phenomenon or relational connection you're participating in to just the payment itself. Okay, imagine that that I'm on a business trip, and I call up an old friend of mine who I haven't seen in several years, and I say to him, hey, I'm going to be in town. Why don't we do lunch? And he says, yeah, man, I'd love to see you, but I've got a real busy week this week. It's going to take a lot of schedule juggling for me to be able to prioritize a lunch with you. And so I say to him, well, why don't I pay you $170 to do lunch with me? If you were on the receiving end of that offer, and you were the old friend, and you're like me, you'd probably feel as though that was a really cheap, crass thing to do. To reduce our friendship to just an exchange of monetary payment. What is it about that makes it feel as though the corruption of the good has taken place? Can someone articulate that for us? What is it about the friendship situation when I offer cash payment that makes it feel as though the friendship is being cheapened by virtue of the monetary transaction? Trying to buy their time? Yeah. Doesn't feel as though it's something that's outside of the calculus of markets. It feels as though it's been brought within some sort of monetary definition. Yeah, I think that's right. Same perhaps goes with grades. Okay, the payment for grades plan might be more motivating, but it also arguably undermines what ought to be intrinsic motivation to do the good in question for its own sake. In other words, to study hard for its own sake. Other attempts have been made to use market-based incentives to try to promote good behavior. One example that Sandel canvasses on pages 55 through 57 is what he calls health bribes. He says healthcare is another area where cash incentives are in vogue. Increasingly, doctors, insurance companies, and employers are paying people to be healthy, paying them to take their medications, to quit smoking, to lose weight. You might think that avoiding disease or life-threatening ailments would be motivation enough, but surprisingly, that's often not the case. 1/3 to 1/2 of patients fail to take their medications as prescribed. When their conditions worsen, the overall result is billions of dollars a year in additional health costs. So doctors and insurers are offering cash incentives to motivate patients to take their meds. Okay, here again, it could be argued that people ought to be motivated for the good to do the good in question for its own sake. Okay, but economists point to the results. And if you read the rest of the section, it looks as though those results in some cases are actually substantial. That health incentives, paying people to engage in good behavior, actually works. So the question then is twofold. There should be a dual question that we should ask. First of all, you want to ask, is the market solution to these kinds of social coordination problems, is it functional? And the second question you should ask is it objectionable? In other words, is it the sort of thing that we would want to do that doesn't bring about more harm than good? So let's ask these two questions. Does it work? And also, is it objectionable? And by objectionable, I just mean, again, we don't want to introduce market-based solutions into our social coordination problems in ways that undermine other things that are valuable, that might be part and parcel of the phenomena in question. Let me read Sandel's response to this on page 57. He writes, from an economic point of view, the case for paying people for good health is a simple matter of costs and benefits. The only real question is whether incentive schemes work. If money motivates people to take their meds, quit smoking, or join a gym, thus reducing the need for expensive care later, why object? And he writes, many do object. The use of cash incentives to promote healthy behavior generates fierce moral controversy. he goes on to look at two objections, which we'll cover in just a minute. One is about fairness and the other about bribery. Before we get to the fairness and bribery objections, let's, though, think a little bit more about the corruption objection. Arguably, good grades and healthy lifestyle, these sorts of things should be pursued for their own sake. And it is the fact of the market calculus that seems to corrupt the good in question, just like it corrupted friendship. Okay, it might not always corrupt the good in question. When I was a little kid, my dad wanted to teach me to play chess. Okay, and I wasn't especially motivated by chess. It was a hard game to learn after all, and I was just 7. But I was motivated by candy. And so my dad paid me candy if I won. And he played just hard enough for me sometimes to beat him, and that was sufficiently motivating. And so I played him chess, and over time I learned how the game worked. And I got candy out of it. And eventually, at some point, I can't remember exactly when, at some point I stopped playing for the sake of the candy. At some point, I became motivated by the game itself, seeing maybe the goods internal to the game, what is intrinsically valuable about the game. The fun of concentrating, the insight, that the energy and excitement that comes from seeing a tactical move that you had to be creative to think of, that sort of thing. Okay, and I became motivated by the game itself. So incentives can go the right way. It's not as though market-based incentives are always going to corrupt permanently. Because in the chess case, the incentives worked to get me to do the behavior in question. But then after a while, I became less motivated by the market-based solution because I began to see the value of the good for its own sake. Okay, good grades and health incentives. Questions or comments so far before we look at a couple of other objections that Sandel wants to canvass here? Questions or comments about what this says about markets and whether markets are corrupting to what they touch? Are market forces corrupting? Suppose that we're talking about something like marriage, right? Some people marry for love, but others marry for money. Is marrying for money a corrupted thing to do? It's not until recently, in the last 100 years or so, that romantic love became an ideal in marriage. If you dial it back several hundred years, those dowries and bride prices and things like that, it was actually an economic exchange in large part as an institution. And yet today it sure feels icky to think of people just marrying for the sake of money, doesn't it? On the other hand, I asked my wife recently whether she still would have dated me if I did not have a job. I had this job when we started dating. If I did not have a job when she first met me, and she looked at me and she said, "Probably not, honey." I appreciate that. We've been married for nearly 10 years, so it's very happy. It's been very happy. She's due in 2 weeks, so we are really excited. Our 4th little girl. Let's look at 2 other objections real quickly. On page 57, Sandel talks about another moral weakness of markets, and that is the fairness objection. Okay, the fairness objection is, I think, not really a different moral weakness than the discriminates against impoverished people objection. I think it's another version of the same, but Sandel separates them, so I'll do so here. The fairness objection is voiced in different ways on both sides of the political spectrum, he says. Some conservatives argue that overweight people should slim down on their own. Paying them to do so unfairly rewards slothful behavior. Okay, some liberals voice the opposite worry, that financial rewards for good health and penalties for bad health can unfairly disadvantage people for medical conditions beyond their control. Okay, point taken. Interesting objections. It does seem unfair if people who haven't ever smoked get penalized by not getting special incentives when people who have smoked get rewarded. What is this number? $750 from General Electric if they can quit smoking for as long as a year. Okay, on the other hand, perhaps the advantages outweigh those disadvantages. Let's look at this second objection, though, before we move on to the more substantive balance of the chapter. This is the bribery objection. The objection here is just that health incentives are bribes. Okay, because you're just bribing somebody to do something that he or she would not otherwise do. The definition of a bribe is something that's a little bit elusive, but I'm not sure I would define a bribe as paying money to get somebody to do what he or she would not otherwise do. Think back to our discussion of bribery earlier in the semester. Does everybody remember that discussion? Maybe you saw the video. Yeah? Okay. We talked about the morality of bribery earlier in the semester. What did we say was wrong with bribery? What's the problem with bribery? There were two main problems with it that we looked at. You guys remember? I know it's in the dim and distant past. I can't remember what I read yesterday. But try to search the filing cabinet and see if you can remember. Yeah, Spencer.
It was like unfair.
It was unfair. That's one of the objections against bribery. You're correct. It is that it actually undermines the fairness of a capitalist market because it doesn't give the work contract or whatever the goodie in question is to the most capable company. It gives it to whoever pays. So it's unfair. Okay, good. And we looked at a second objection. Anybody remember what that was? So no. You're right. I was thinking of two objections. With the unfairness is a deontological objection, and then there's also a consequential objection. But you're totally right. We looked at a motivational objection as well. Okay, and that was that it undermines confidence in the system. You're absolutely right, Maddie. Okay, I was just thinking of the consequentialist objection that it actually leads to inefficiencies in the society, and in particular, it leads to poverty because the inefficiencies are so damaging. They undermine prosperity in the society. Okay, and we looked at the countries that are most corrupt in terms of bribery, and they're all, in fact, the poorest countries in the world. And this is because there's a strong, close association between bribery and poverty. Because of those kinds of investigations, I'm not sure if I think that the definition of a bribe is a monetary payment to get somebody to do something that he or she would not otherwise have been willing to do. I think that a bribe would need to have some component of its definition be that there are competitors, and those competitors are not given the reward in question because of the bribe. Okay, otherwise I'm not sure that it's a bribe as such. I'd have to think about it, but I don't know if I find this to be a very convincing objection, at least as Sandel expresses it. But for what it's worth, it is something that he thinks is a legitimate objection against the morality of markets here. Okay, let me move on and point out a couple of other things before we get to this fines versus fees distinction to tease out the motivational impact of market forces on human behavior. Okay, sometimes there are very interesting and bizarre outcomes that result from market forces being introduced into a particular scenario. So let's take this example. On pages 62 and 63. The United States for a long time has had an immigration problem. Okay, and the problem is that citizenship in the United States is a scarce and much desired good. It's not that scarce. About 1/20th of the world or so, a little bit less, maybe 1/25th of the world has United States citizenship. So it's not real scarce. And there are a lot of people, so you can often get in. But it is a scarce good and it's much desired. And there's a long waiting line if you want to get in legally. So market forces, perhaps, we could reason, could be used to resolve this clear social coordination problem. It's a line standing problem, basically. Let's use market forces to sort the people who really want American citizenship from the people who don't, by giving citizenship to the people who are willing to pay the most. In fact, actually, there is already a provision for this. On the bottom of page 62, it's listed here. In 1990, the United States Congress provided that foreigners who invested $500,000 in the United States could immigrate with their families for 2 years, after which they could receive a permanent green card if the investment created at least 10 jobs. So apparently we actually have some kind of a system like that already in place. It could perhaps be strengthened, though. And from an economic perspective, we could be looking at exchanges of mutual benefit. Okay, so it would be mutually beneficial for the United States and for its potential immigrant population to make it a transaction, a monetary transaction, it could be argued. It would be beneficial to the United States because it would bring money in. People would pay. It would be beneficial to the immigrants in question because only those people who wanted citizenship would be willing to pay whatever market forces dictates in order to obtain that citizenship. And those who presumably didn't want citizenship, again, presumably, wouldn't be willing to pay the price. What do we think of such a solution to solving a social coordination problem like that? Is that something that seems like an advantageous, future-oriented sort of a solution? Or does it feel crass and reductivist, as though it's making people into just things that can be shifted around in a financial board of some sort? What do we think? Tough crowd this morning. Here.
I think the second thing.
Oh, Kristen, thank you. Okay. Second thing I said, it feels as though it reduces human beings to objects. Yeah. I think so too. Yeah. Not to mention that it would honestly discriminate against refugees and other people who don't have the ability to pay. Let me make this much clearer by making it personal. Okay, so I'm going to shift the example. I'm going to switch the example from immigration. I'll just make it personal so you guys can think of it in your own case. Okay, you have 2 kidneys. You could sell one and make money if we allowed a market in body parts. Maybe you could sell it for a lot of money. I don't know how much kidneys would go for, but I suspect it would be upwards of 50,000, maybe even 100K. There's a lot of student debt these days. The government's talking about forgiving our student loans, but that's a ways off and it might not happen. Some of us have pretty substantial student loans. You could get your student loan wiped out if you just sold your kidney. Would somebody be willing to hawk a kidney on eBay for $100K? Who would do that? You have another, so it's not as though you're going to be endangering your health. Who would do that for $100K? Let's just make this personal. Oh, come on. Some of us would. $200K? Sell your kidney, $200K. $500K. None of us in this room would sell a kidney for $500K. I'm floored. Maybe people are like, I don't want to be known as that person. You don't like hospitals. Okay.
I'm sure there would be a general.
I think so too. Yeah. I think there would be. Okay. Be afraid of the process. Fair enough. I can understand that. Imagine, though, that you are not somebody with means. And we're talking about a market for kidneys where you could sell your kidney for $500K. And maybe you've got serious student loans. And let's imagine several years out of college, and maybe you've got dependents. Okay, you've had a couple kids and you got dependents, and you got to, keep the family functional. At that point, that $500K might not feel as though it's a voluntary choice. It might feel like soft coercion. Does everybody see that? Does everybody see how the less you have, the more that kind of a market-based solution becomes coercive? And it's precisely proportional to how much you have. If you have very little, it's highly coercive. Okay, if you have a lot, it's almost not coercive at all. And it's all because of the way that market forces work on our motivations and incentivize us to do certain things. Okay, I could reference a couple other examples. Okay, so let me just give you guys one example before we look at the fines and fees section so I can just illustrate that in a different way. There's a big social coordination problem right now in the United States in the world of adoption. We could call it a market, but it's not really a market. And that is that a whole lot more people want to adopt than kids are available. Okay, and part of it is a matter of people who want to give their kids up for adoption not being able to coordinate with people who want to receive kids for adoption. But it has meant that a lot of Americans have looked overseas. They've looked elsewhere. Some have argued that the best way to resolve the social coordination problem would just be to sell the kids straight up. Okay, and immediately like this feels horrible, right? But it totally would solve the problem. It absolutely would solve the problem in terms of social coordination, in that the people who most want the kids would be the ones who, with a few exceptions, would be most likely to pay. Okay, and yet that feels icky to me, and it probably feels icky to almost everybody else, and it's because of the way that markets impact our motivations and seem to skew things when money becomes involved. Let me look at one final aspect of the chapter. This is the fines versus fees distinction. Again, if you haven't read the chapter, please do so. I think you'll get a lot more out of this discussion today if you're able to look at the text for itself. And otherwise, it's just a lecture without any textual background, and it's harder for people to follow it and to understand what's going on. So on page 65, Sandel talks about the fines versus fees distinction in the context of market-based thinking. He writes here, what is the difference between a fine and a fee? It's worth pondering the distinction. Fines register moral disapproval, whereas fees are simply prices that imply no moral judgment. When we impose a fine for littering, we're saying that littering is wrong. Okay, the fact that littering is finable makes it something that is registered as meriting moral disapproval. Let's think of this, though, in terms of something more personal than, say, littering for most of us. How about speeding tickets? Who has gotten probably the most expensive speeding ticket in this class? Maddie, how much was your speeding ticket? $350? Can anybody top $350? How fast are you going? 86 and a 60? That's not that bad. I agree. Ooh, in Alabama? Or no, Huntsville, Texas. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, just up the road. Okay. Well, that's not that bad. Did that motivate you to not do that in the future? How long did you abide by the speed limit after that before your behavior started breaking down? What's that? Oh, you're still not speeding. That's great. How long ago was this? Oh, okay, last week. All right. Just give it a couple months. We'll see. Most people, after some sort of discipline, regulate their own behavior for a while, but then they become lax and they forget about the discipline, and it's easy to slip back into previous habits. Sandel writes on page 66, when people treat fines as fees, they flout the norms that fines express. Okay, in Finland, the country of Finland, the law leans hard against that way of thinking by basing fines on the income of the offender. This is for speeding. In 2003, for instance, this dude, UC Salonoja, the 27-year-old heir to a sausage business, so he's real wealthy, he was fined about $217,000 for driving 50 miles per hour in the 25 mile per hour zone. We have speeding tickets that are the same for everybody. Okay, based, of course, on local cities, revenue needs, and that sort of thing. But it's not based on how much income you have. If we based it on how much income you have, it might be a very different kind of a disciplinary measure. Okay, what makes the Finnish speeding tickets fines rather than fees is not just the fact that they vary with income, it's the moral opprobrium that lies behind them, Sandel writes, the judgment that violating the speed limit is wrong. Okay, and there are a couple of other examples of this that Sandel uses. One example is parents picking their kids up from daycare. Okay, you'll understand this when you're a parent and you've had a long day at work and you have to pick your kid up on time after school. Okay, when there studies have been done, and apparently when parents are picking their kids up from daycare or from school, they typically tend to run late. Most parents actually run late. But when schools try to solve this by fining the parents when they run late, the parents actually run even later than they previously did. So parents who were running late and picking their kids up at 4 p.m. when the school let out at 3:30 and they should have picked them up earlier, now pick them up at 4:30 when the school charges them $30 an hour. Why might that be the case? Why might it be the case that the introduction of the monetary calculus actually doesn't work as a good incentive to promote more upstanding behavior? Does anybody have a theory there? Yeah, Maria.
I feel like since they're paying that extra money, they have like the rights to like leave their kids longer.
Totally.
Like, their money work situation.
Yeah, totally. You're absolutely right. So it's as if they felt as though they were being assessed a fee. And this fee now is something that they thought, well, it's basically like I'm paying for after-school care. And so it motivated them to behave worse than they otherwise would have done. Okay, so incentives in the calculus of the markets don't always work the right way. Okay, they don't always work they don't always work to get people to behave better. They sometimes actually get people to behave worse. Let me highlight one final example of this, something that is a very fraught issue these days. Okay, and that's the example. Again, we're still within the overall context of fines versus fees. That is the cap and trade program as a way of resolving pollution. Sorry if this lecture is a little bit all over the place. It's the way Sandel writes. He's mostly just illustrating the strengths and weaknesses of markets, but he uses examples from a variety of different walks of life. Tradable pollution permits, though. If the government told all the coal companies, look, you all have to keep your emissions this year at, we'll say, 100 blorps of carbon waste. Okay, let's say 1,000 total is what the government wants to allow. Let's say there are 10 coal companies. And let's say the government says 1,000 divided by 10 is 100, so 100 per company. You guys all have to keep your emissions this year limited to 100 blorps. I don't know how these things are actually measured, probably not in blorps. Some have argued that this is inefficient. Okay, a lot of market advocates have said that approaching the topic of pollution by levying the same limit on all the coal companies is actually an inefficient way to approach the topic of pollution. Instead, a market-based solution should be introduced. And the reason why is because each coal company knows what's best in its own case. Just like you personally know what's best for you, and in your own case, you know how you want to spend your money, so also the coal companies know what's best for them individually and know, presumably, how they most want to spend their money. So some have argued a market-based solution could be introduced here where there are a variety of different coal companies, and each one of them gets a tradable pollution permit. And that tradable pollution permit is 100 blorps, we'll say, but it's not 100 blorps, end of story. It's 100 blorps which they can then exchange with others. And some coal companies might actually find it in their interests to purchase the right to pollute from others if market-based solutions are introduced here. And we'll say a bunch of these companies all sell their rights to this company, which finds it actually in its interests to pollute much more than is allowed by the 100 blorp limit. And so they then accumulate a 500 blorp limit, which actually is worth it to them. Maybe because it would have been so expensive for them to introduce the filtering systems and the other kinds of pollution regulation systems that would have brought them down to the 100 blorp number. And maybe these others find that it's actually in their interest less than 100 blorps if they can make money by selling their right to pollute to the company that wants to pollute more. This is a concept that is widely used these days because market-based solutions are so efficient. It's pretty clear that this would be much more efficient as a system for reducing pollution emissions than a system where it's just strictly 100 per company as such. And yet a whole bunch of people, including a lot of environmental activists, have said that this is a terrible solution, a market-based solution. The reason why it's terrible is because it gives some people the, quote, right to pollute. It gives them some companies have the ability under a cap and trade system with tradable pollution permits. Some companies are given by this kind of a system the right to do something that some people would say is just morally wrong and they ought not to be able to do. So this sort of a system tells everybody, look, you guys all need to behave a certain way. No exceptions. And it sends the signal that there's a certain moral rightness here that everybody needs to conform to. Whereas this system, and it does so in an inefficient way, this system maximizes efficiency, but it does so at the expense of this non-market-based motive that coal companies might otherwise have under this system. The non-market-based motive is something that goes away because under a market-based system, people and companies become motivated by the money and not necessarily by the good behavior that's desired in question. So the participants in this sort of a system see themselves as participating in a system where they can maximize their own gain, as opposed to the participants in this system who might see themselves primarily as being motivated by a desire to be good citizens as such. Does everyone kind of understand that last point that Sandel was making? I know I went through that pretty quickly, and apologies if I did. It'll make more sense if you've read the chapter. Please read the chapter. Does everyone kind of get that last point? Okay, good. That's fair enough. All right, take a look at the chapter, and we will be moving on to the last couple chapters in Sandel's text on what money can't buy and the moral strengths and weaknesses of markets on Wednesday, so please see the video there. Yeah, if you have any questions about the final, email is the fastest way to reach me. Okay? You guys take care. It's good to see you all. Take care, Kristen.